Hello and welcome to Fintech Focus TV with me, Toby Bab. Delighted to be joined today live from San Francisco with Gabriele Columbro. Gabriele, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Toby?
I'm really good, thanks. Really good. So listen, thanks so much for joining us. FINOS, the community that you're building at the moment, some really exciting times. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you founded the company.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here and for this opportunity. So it's been now an interesting ride for 5 years, I would say, 4.5. I personally come from open source through and through, community open source. I've grown up, my background is in technology, and so I've participated to open source communities pretty much right out of college. And then I have, of course, evolved into commercial open source. I worked for a UK-based company called Fresco for about 10 years, sort of really covering all different, the full spectrum of roles within the company, starting from, technical to product manager to consultants. I kind of was able to really have a good overview of, the different drivers and forces within a software company, maybe a little bigger than a startup. And so then in 2016, I had the honor to be called to run what was called at the time the Symphony Software Foundation. It was a venture, a non-profit open source foundation created to build a community around a pretty renowned software called Symphony, which is a chat collaboration platform in capital markets. And that really gave us the sort of initial understanding that open source in financial services could be a thing after being an oxymoron for many years. And then we expanded into FINOS, the Fintech Open Source Foundation, in mid 2018. And that's where we saw, massive growth and the opportunity of open source in financial services. And as you can hear, I'm Italian by my accent. So as much as I live in San Francisco,
understand as well. There's 5 languages you speak? Is that right?
I guess. I mean, some of them better than others. Italian, Spanish, and English. I'll let you judge, but definitely those are the 3. But yeah, I spent also 8 years in Holland, and as much as you don't really need to speak Dutch in Holland, given they're very, very good with their English, I certainly pick some up. So
picked up as well. So look, you mentioned something there that I find really interesting about the sort of opportunities for open source in the fintech space, and I guess that this is a fascinating time because digital innovation is something that's on hyperspeed at the moment, right? And from a horrific situation that we're in globally, there are massive efficiency gains, and thank God for technology at the moment, right? Because it's allowed everything to operate. And when we see, if we look at digital innovation as a whole, and I've heard, Microsoft saying that its CEO saying that it's 2 years worth of innovation in 2 months. If we actually look at this a little bit further, we're probably in the financial services space, which has taken 20 years to really adopt cloud technology. If we're looking at things here, I think it's probably, it's far, far greater than that. And I think we've probably seen about 10 years worth of innovation in finance from it. And fintech's been growing at pace. Tell us a little bit about the opportunities with open source and what it means for the fintech space at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, look, you're, spot on. As of course, this is a really hard situation that the world is going through. But I think that there is a silver lining. There is a silver lining for open source, and there is a silver lining, at least again, for technology in terms of accelerating, the digital transformation. Talking about the opportunity, there's an opportunity that we think we identified about, as I said, 3-4 years ago, which is, large financial institutions, very much like any other industry has done, over the last 20 years, have a major opportunity through open source to reduce cost, mutualize, their technology investments when it comes to non-differentiating IP and technology. And if you think about, again, going back to the digital transformation, how much legacy technology there is within each of these firms, and oftentimes how expensive, these migration, merging projects can take in some of these firms, especially if you think about, software that was acquired or companies that were sort of, came in through M&As. Open source really provides a way to leapfrog in the next generation. You can go and migrate and merge, or you can decide to sort of jump one or two generations of software and use best of breed open source. And so, the original value proposition of the foundation was really to leverage open source and open standards as means to an end. Our goal is to drive innovation, and open source and open standards have proven over the last couple of decades to be, a really important driver for innovation. There would be no cloud, there would be no SQL, there would be no blockchain if it wasn't for the open source movement. So that was the original, opportunity that we saw. And, we think that as the community matures and gets more comfortable with not just consuming open source, which has been happening, for a while, but really contributing, collaborating, either contributing net new code that comes from one of the firms, or collaborating on common challenges that really impact everyone in the industry. We think that that's going to get an acceleration. But on the flip side, you mentioned sort of fintech firms, the new generation of fintech firms. I think there is a huge opportunity for them as well, and a largely untapped one. I come again from San Francisco, I guess the Italian part of San Francisco, and open source here, both as a development methodology, but more importantly, as a business model, commercial open source, is very much entrenched. It's very much part of the development strategies and, again, business models of many companies here. I have not seen the same yet to the same extent in in the fintech world. I think there is a huge opportunity there, because it's still largely a highly locked in market. If you think that there are major vendors who, can very much almost control a certain use cases in an almost monopolistic way. And if you compare that with the fact that there's really no, heavily successful open source fintech venture, if you pair the two things together, we think that there's a huge opportunity to, again, make money out of open source. To be very clear, we're not hippies here. The goal is, the goal here is to enable both financial institutions to save money and fintech firms to, leverage open source as part of the business strategy, so that some of their profits will be reinvested in the community. That's really how most foundations work. So that's where we see a huge opportunity.
So you mentioned there that this hasn't sort of taken off so far in the fintech space, and you being in the very heart of global digital and software development out there in San Francisco.
Yeah.
What's been the barriers? I mean, we know that capital markets in particular aren't quick adopters of cutting edge technology. We know there's procurement issues. We know how it takes a long time for it. But when you look at the benefits, and you're talking there about the speed of innovation, you're talking about cost, you're talking about user benefit. These are all things that are huge in the financial services space at the moment. And this is something which can do it. What bridges do we have to get over? What do we have to climb at the moment?
That's a really good question. And again, there's two parts to the answer. One that is more related to financial institutions, and another one that I think it's more related to, the new generation of fintech firms, the new kids on the block. But as far as the financial institutions, and I want to preface by saying that this is changing fast. Even from the start of FINOS in the last 2 years, we have seen massive progress, from financial institutions contributing to open source. We received last November a major contribution from Goldman Sachs, the Alloy a logical modeling platform. A major contribution from JP Morgan called Perspective is their visualization library, a battle-tested framework. Deutsche Bank with Plexus and Waltz. So, kudos to them. I don't want to paint too negative a picture here, because the industry is changing, and the context that we're moving in is actually accelerating the change. And we'll talk about it hopefully as we look sort of post-pandemic. But historically, I think it's been mostly an issue, a cultural issue, in a way policy issue, and certainly some technology issue. These are the sort of three pillars of what we call our open source readiness program. One of the earliest initiatives in our foundation was really educating the firms as to how they could leverage open source successfully at a strategic level. And so, that goes really to these three pillars: ensure that you have policies and a legal understanding of what is open source. There's been a lot of myths around the risks of open source that I think by now are largely debunked. There's a need for a good technology toolchain that allows you to consume and contribute open source in a safe and compliant way. Again, it's not easy, let's be clear, and that's why foundations like us exist. And certainly, cultural and sort of just really business understanding. Some of these myths over the years have created sort of this impression that open source is free, or that open source is, hobbyist type thing. And most of other industries sort of went through this process, I think, about 10, 15 years ago. I think financial industry is really in the middle of the process of understanding that this is much more than that. It's a way, again, to save costs, to innovate faster, and to honestly bring in talent. I think, and I think the key, if I had to point out one aspect that really moved several of the executives that sit on my board and that I have the honor to work with, it's really the conversation around talent. Open source not only broadens your sort of talent pool or addressable talent, if you want, but also having a strong open source policy, allowing your developers to be able to continue contribute to open source as they come into a financial institution, and so continue to develop their portfolio. It's something that really resonated, and it's really moving mountains in some ways.
I think that's a critical. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's such
no worries.
A critical part of this, isn't it? That we look at the great talent drain from financial services and technology, and I started 20 years ago in the industry, and 20 years ago, if you were a technologist, you needed to work in a bank, you needed to work in FS. And right now, again, going back to San Francisco, there's so many companies that almost make it cooler to work in than FS, and the financial gains aren't the same sort of difference. You blow your money out the water if you were working with a bank. It's a different playing field now, and the need to maintain and hold that talent, and for developers in particular, not to be moved by money, but by purpose and mission, and the ability to work on cool and interesting projects. That becomes so important to what you're talking about now, right?
You are spot on. And again, as a technologist at heart, albeit they don't allow me to touch code anymore since I run a company now, but you're spot on. The inherent drivers that developers have, like intrinsic motivators of trying to solve problems, and really open source allow you to solve bigger problems than you could do within your individual effort or team or firewall. Certainly it's been a huge, again, selling point, quote unquote, to get this started. But the truth is, you have to nurture this as a financial institution. This is not just about marketing. You can't just say join a foundation or put out a couple of sort of semi-dead open source projects and expect that talent will continue coming. You need to invest in open source and having a strategy and really make it a part of your, again, overall technology strategy. I think open source is, without a doubt a CIO level concern by now. I mean, just, you see, you touch on the digital transformation, and cloud, and the move to cloud being a huge pillar of it. I mean, we've heard Goldman over the last few months announcing, their sort of really strong push to move some of their key platforms to AWS, really turning into a, platform company with their sort of developers being their main audience. And I argue that really great things happen at the intersection between cloud and open source, because they are very complementary models. There would be no cloud without open source. Open source would not have grown as fast without, SaaS business models that allow a much sort of clean split between what the code is and what is the service that you're actually delivering to your customers. And so again, if there is one message that I want to pass here, is certainly that digital transformation is not only going to cloud. Open source can really help when used properly and when, strategically contributed to accelerate that process.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating sort of time for it. And look, we touched on it earlier on about the legacy of this time period that we're going through. We know we know there's going to be fundamental changes to the way people work. We know there's going to be fundamental changes to how people spend, to how banking and financial services as an industry change and adopt opportunities from. Get your crystal ball out and tell us a little bit about what you think this means for open source and the sort of impact it will have in the financial services space.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, let's not fool ourselves. Of course, this year, for the rest of the year, it's going to be a complex, period for everyone. I would argue, though, maybe a little less for financial institutions than your Main Street, crisis that we're seeing. This is largely, in my mind, from an economic standpoint, a Main Street crisis rather than, like 2008, sort of a liquidity crisis. So, yes, there will be, complexities throughout the year, also for, foundations like us. But we have a strong feeling that open source will come out much stronger on the other side of this pandemic. I actually sort of blog about it, and we're trying to really, again, find the silver lining here. It is historically common that, in this big crisis, the market becomes risk averse. We think that actually open source is a great way to mitigate risks in your technology investments. Rather than building, everything in a silo. If you are able to identify sort of where the value line is, meaning what is your competitive differentiator versus what, everything else that really is plumbing, whether it's, how you implement regulatory requirements or how you run your sort of core infrastructure. Again, those are all, in a way, commodities at this point, or should be commodities. And so we think that actually open source will come out much stronger on the other side, where there's going to be an even sort of heightened pressure for making smart technology investments. And we definitely think that the venue that foundations like FINOS provide, that, again, it's not easy to do open source, but we have a really good sort of trusted network and governance and sort of the legal framework. Everyone is sort of ready there to contribute, sort of a ready-made community. We think that's going to be, generally an even stronger climate for open source after this. When it comes to, specifically sort of the digital transformation you mentioned, we think we're seeing a massive acceleration, in just 2 months, almost at warp speed. And the way this relates to open source is, I think, more impactful than someone might think, sort of on high level. One of the huge challenges that we've had as as open source people, I'm probably not a millennial, but maybe on the cusp, but, millennials and post, it's what from an open source standpoint we refer to as the GitHub generation. You know, you are grown up in GitHub. You can go to GitHub, find code, post code. You know, it's really the social network of open source, if you want. And you know, some of these financial institutions, developers at, you know, any one of these financial institutions until 2 or 3 years ago, sometimes couldn't even access GitHub. So there was a really strong sort of barrier there of entry. If you wanna, you know, you either, as a FINOS, we either will adapt to the limitations that these financial institutions have, or, as we did, have an open source readiness program that would help them being able to work in best of breed, largely cloud-based, you know, development tools. And so we do think that, you know, I was reading an article last Friday, again, quoting Goldman here, a trader from Goldman was working from home, and she's saying that, you know, the workforce has become so productive from home that she doesn't really think they're gonna all go back, you know, 36,000 people at 200 West in New York. You know, between Symphony as a chat platform, Zoom as we're using as a video platform. So we actually do think that this sort of forced remote working has and will accelerate the process of, you know, feeling more comfortable with just working in, you know, standard cloud environments or SaaS services, which in our case would be, you know, development tools and development sort of best of breed tool chain. And so, yeah, we think that also from a comfort with open source and sort of with working with public infrastructure, this pandemic can certainly sort of accelerate some of the long-standing challenges that made, you know, financial services and other regulated industries a bit of a special duck.
I want to touch on that working from home piece, because I think it's, you know, we're running a round table tomorrow with 15 CTOs who are talking about the sort of future of developers, and it's been a common sort of common piece of feedback that people are becoming very comfortable working from, you know, from home. And is this the new normal that we have? You know, I think Barclays was saying something recently about 7,000 people in Canary Wharf here in London, potentially having the same sort of scale of work, and is at the end of the huge office buildings and office spaces. Open source is obviously allows, and cloud technology allows a lot more flexibility around this sort of stuff. I think there's definitely going to be a legacy that comes through where we do see a different workplace, which I know people have been talking about and pushing for some time. What impact do you see this, and how much is open source, you know, a genuine enabler for this, and what are the benefits that you're seeing from that? Do you see it? I'm going to ask about 15 questions all in one here, which I know I shouldn't do, but the last
I'm taking notes.
Yeah, the last one being, do you see a completely different world of work after this in terms of you know, where people do it from in development?
Well, look, again, two parts to the answer. The first is, you know, I've been since the, you know, the start of the outbreak. You know, I've instituted the work from home policy for our firm, and, you know, of course, we are as a foundation working with so many, you know, diverse members from financial institutions from here in the West Coast, and many members from the UK and other banks in Europe. You know, this is a business that, again, until 3 months ago was still largely, you know, handshake driven, especially for me to close a new platinum member or you know, a large institution, you certainly have to be there. On the flip side, open source is remote and distributed by nature. It thrives on, and actually would not work if, you know, you don't keep a public task list, your issues in GitHub, and, you know, invite other potentially random contributors, of course, with some kind of governance provided by a foundation like us. But, you know, it is funded on, you know, distributed workforce and the exponential productivity that a distributed workforce can provide. And so, you know, I've told our guys, our employees, so many times how lucky we feel and we are to be in, you know, open source in this period where really we've seen much less of an impact in our day-by-day operations. When it comes to sort of the future, I think, again, I don't know that open source specifically will be, the enabler for a completely new digital workplace. I think like many other industries, open source is going to take over. Mark Andreessen was saying that software was eating the world, and we like to say that open source is eating software. And so, I do think that the trend will continue and continue potentially taking over. There are several open source, efforts also on the, again, work productivity side of the house. But I do think that the cultural aspect, again, going back to that, is going to be where open source can really help. We are used to this. I've been working for 20 years with people all over the world, regardless even of their affiliation or of their provenance. And so I think those who have participated to open source communities and are familiar with that are in a much better place right now to continue developing and bringing it into their firm. Inner source, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but is the sort of within the firewall version of open source. Yeah. And those who have had this experience already, I think they're going to be much better positioned to continue being as productive, if not more, I would argue, than in a completely sort of co-located workspace. And I want to be clear, I don't discount the importance of face-to-face. I am a big fan of at least once a quarter getting our team, which is global, between Spain, UK, New York, and San Francisco, in the same place. I think, as an Italian, I'm pretty fond of social relationships, and maybe we have even less of a bubble than many other countries. But we think we are very well positioned as an open source community to continue delivering and helping, more closed environments sort of in this bridge.
Yeah, I think it sets for a fascinating future, and I could talk about this with you for absolutely hours. But I know we're on the clock, so I'm gonna ask you a couple of last questions.
Please.
One of which is just we're here in London and we hear a global picture. Tell us a little bit about what's happening out in San Francisco at the moment, both socially, economically, and in terms of tech. What are we seeing out there right now?
Well, so look, of course, the pandemic has sort of slowed down or certainly impacted sort of what we were seeing a couple of months ago. But from a social standpoint, I think California, it's one of the most sort of progressive states in the US, and has certainly responded in a very careful way to this pandemic. So we're fairly lucky, as much as I'm getting a little bit of cabin fever here after a couple of months at home. We think that yes, that's
we won't go there.
That's a little crazy, but well, it's funny because I've seen protests also for people that were like, continue stay at home. I'm like, dude, just don't go in the street protesting for that. That's sort of do a Zoom protest. But anyway, I think, look, the California is certainly a very lively place from an entrepreneurial standpoint, and we're seeing more and more fintech investments also here out west. Many of the financial services firms have their innovation labs here in the valley. I think there is a lot of cross-pollination, and we sort of built our foundation around this idea of cross-pollinating sort of quote unquote the West Coast with the East Coast. We have a very diverse set of members between sort of the Red Hat, the GitHubs, the really big tech company here out west, and we're seeing sort of a really strong hate and love relationship between the East and the West Coast. But there is actually, becoming really productive. There's many financial institutions look at models from here, the West Coast, on how you actually build and deliver technology, as increasingly financial service institutions look at themselves as technology companies. And from a more generally sort of cultural standpoint or social standpoint, I think, again, California is a bit of a different place than many other parts of the US. So we are, I guess, fundamentally pretty lucky that the pandemic was contained. We are in this interesting period where we're looking what's going to happen next. And, of course, the situation is far from under control, but we're pretty hopeful.
Yeah. Well, listen, I wish you the very best of luck with it, and stay safe, and hopefully we'll be through, we're through the worst, and we can continue to look at all the positives from this. And as we say, look, I think there's a great opportunity for what you're doing. I am sure there's going to be people who are watching this who are interested in what you're talking about and want to take the conversation a little bit further as well. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, Toby, thanks for the opportunity, and we'd love to talk open source in financial services. Our community is open to everyone. You don't have to be a large financial institution to contribute a project to FINOS or contribute to existing projects. We, individual contributors and the sweat equity they can bring to the foundation is what, grows our movement. And so best way to contact us, have a look at our website, finos.org. Reach out to me at gab@finos.org. I'm very, very accessible. I might be a little slow as I'm buried in email lately, but please, we'd love to hear from you. There's, I think, a lot of opportunities, whether you are an individual, early stage startup founder. We have something really good going in terms of all these banks, curiously looking at how open source can change their technology landscape. And so this is a huge opportunity for everyone, we think.
I think it's a genuinely fascinating thing that you guys are doing over there, and there's so much opportunity in it. So I wish you the very, very best of luck. Thanks for taking the time. I know how busy it is for everyone at the moment, and you just sharing that insight is helpful to so many people. So really appreciate it. It's lovely to have you on the show.